is a resident of Memphis, Tennessee, and a 2016 graduate of DePaul University's Masters of Arts in Writing and Publishing. She has over a decade of editorial experience with various literary magazines, small presses, and best-selling authors. Avery grew up surrounded by exceptional African Americans who strive to uplift their communities while also maintaining a hold on prosperity in a starkly segregated environment. The sensation of being at once within and without is something that she has grappled with since childhood and explores thoroughly in her works of historical fiction. Her debut novel, The Mayor of Maxwell Street, is at once an epic love story, a riveting historical drama, and a brilliant exploration of Black society and perseverance when the 20s first began to roar. This historical fiction novel follows a Southern Black family season in 1921 Chicago, and according to Avery, defies the usual media depictions of Black people in distress. She said she wanted to explore all the complexities of that Black house society: colorism, classism, internal bias, conflict between academic and nouveau-rich spheres of influence. When she's not writing, she is adventuring with her Bernese Mountain Dog Grizzly, who attended in March and somehow is not here today, and wading waist deep into research for her next novel. She aspires to tell the stories of complex characters fighting for their rights to exist on the fringes of history. So welcome, Avery. Thank you so much for being here.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I know you've had a very long day, so I'm grateful to be included in this wonderful conference and gathering. I grew up in libraries. My mother was on the board of my local library in Jackson, Tennessee, about 2 hours from here. So being a part of this celebration of libraries and librarians and friends of the libraries, those who keep those types of institutions present and active in our different communities, is truly an honor for me, and I'm so glad to be back in Brentwood, back at the beautiful Brentwood Library. I think about this library constantly every time I go to the Memphis Library, which is gorgeous. I was like, Cleveland, Brentwood. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to have another conversation with the wonderful Mary Catherine. We'll do this type of conversation similar to the previous ones. I'll start with a reading from the novel, then we'll do some Q&A here, and then we can open it up to questions from everyone else. So to talk a little bit more about The Mayor of Maxwell Street, it is my debut novel. It was published back in January. I guess it's getting close to a year now. A long time. But it is a story of perseverance, a story of discovery, and when talking about the inspiration for The Mayor of Maxwell Street, I always say that it's a bit of a cross between The Great Gatsby, which I was reading in 2020 along with everybody else when it entered the public domain. All my author friends were scrabbling to get that first Great Gatsby retelling. And I was really fascinated by the world anew of this tale of striving to be oneself in a world that was strictly formulated around a romantic idea of prosperity and the American dream. And I stumbled upon some academia when I was reading Great Gatsby that posed this question, this idea that you could read Jay Gatsby as a non-white character passing. Of course, I don't think that was Fitzgerald's intent. He was a consummate racist, but I do believe that reading Great Gatsby through that lens has offered some wonderful new insights into the 1920s, into the American dream, into what that era was for so many Americans and what it couldn't be for so many Americans. And that was really the initial spark for The Mayor of Maxwell Street. And beyond that, I became really fascinated with the original Black upper class. I read The Warmth of Other Suns, of course, by Isabel Wilkerson. I read Not Our Kind of People by the late Lawrence Otis Graham, and I was fascinated by this entire new realm of American history that I was never exposed to in academia, was exposed to the best of my parents' ability in my home. So this chance to explore this entire branch of American society was something I was really drawn to. And both of those ideas really came to fruition in The Mayor of Maxwell Street, along with a lot of other things. It's a very big book. There's a lot going on in there. But we'll totally get into that conversation a little bit more, but I do want to start off with a quick reading from the prologue, where we're meeting one of our main characters for the first time. We know him throughout most of the novel as Jay Shorey, but in this prologue and the scenes that we meet him in at the beginning. He's simply Jimmy Blue Eyes. This is set in 1915 Alabama for the prologue, so just a quick warning that this does deal with Jim Crow laws, and the consequences that many Black Americans had to face living in that time and in that area of our country. So just making that clear to everyone before we get started, but we'll do that, and then we'll go into some questions. I'm going to try to do this. I know I can. I've done it before. I do both at the same time. Good. I think we'll just make this magic. It was well and truly dark by the time Jimmy made it back to Woodacre. As he walked down the single road that stitched their community together, golden beams split out of doors onto the ground before him. The smell of fading cook fires lingered outside every threshold. Their home looked no different than any of the others, built of thin, splintering clapboard, once painted white, now turned to a dull gray. Inside, Uncle sat in his rocking chair, smoking and staring into nothing with his milk-white eyes. He hummed an old song, one that had no name and no lyrics, only a rhythm. Jimmy? His voice was muffled by a gnarled tobacco pipe. Nigh on evening time. I know. Jimmy closed the door behind him. I'm sorry, I got lost on the road in the dark. Not the kind of road you'd be getting lost on. I know, Jimmy said again, and recognized the impudence in his tone just as Uncle did. Don't snap at me now. Half the neighborhood's been out looking for you. Jimmy dropped his body into the matching rocking chair as he would drop a sack of animal feed. Everything in him felt heavy and worn to nubs. I know, he said one final time. Heard the Buick head back to White Pine round dusk, Uncle said. They say Miss Cecilia was driving. Didn't know that trick of a girl could drive. On a roughly hewn edge of a sigh, Jimmy said, Miss Cecilia is familiar with many surprising and disconcerting things. He could feel his uncle's eyes on him, even though they saw no more. The heat of that stare rivaled the heat of an open fire. Something you need to tell me? Uncle asked. Jimmy wanted to reveal everything in its stark and unflinching truth. His plan had been to do just that. On the long, dark walk back to Woodacre, he had talked himself through the conversation, through 1,000 such conversations. And yet something held him back. Call it pride, call it a new type of terror. No, sir. The silence they dwelt in was dense and layered with things said and unsaid. After all, there was no true silence in these parts. The horned owl and coyote and the bobcat crowd and their hunky growls made the air rumble like a far-off storm. Someone was hitting him, punching him, slapping him all about the head. A voice drifted above, beyond the submergence of strange dreams. And don't you lie to me. Jimmy rubbed the sleep from his eyes and saw Uncle standing over him. One hand held fast the neck of his nightshirt, and the other was drawn back, ready to land another blow. Lie to you? Jimmy asked, half dead to the world. He was aware enough to notice a change in the light, a thin blue like dewdrops. Not quite morning, but not quite night either. His eyes drifted close, sleep pulling him down. His uncle shook him, and his head jostled back until he bounced against the floor. Clean out your ears, boy. Uncle's voice sounded as far away and omnipresent as the voice of God. I said, did you get fresh with Miss Cecilia? No, Jimmy said, drowsy, and then insisted, no, I would never be so. Then he remembered. He closed his eyes tight until stars burst behind his lids. Uncle, you best measure your next words to me, Uncle said. I asked you straight if you had something to tell me, didn't I? But nothing happened. I drove her to town, and she drove herself back. You come sneaking home in the midnight hour, her speeding through here like the first bat out of hell. If you don't tell me the truth, I can't protect you, boy. Now, did you touch Miss Cecilia? Jimmy pulled the man close and looked into his face, selfishly wishing his uncle could look back and see the desperation in his eyes. I did not touch Cecilia, he said, but she touched me. Jimmy wasn't prepared to explain further, and judging by the way Uncle's brows lifted and then resolutely settled again, no further explanation was needed. After a moment, the old man said, and you refused her. A cruel instinct caused Jimmy to laugh and say, was I not meant to? Uncle's hand came up and landed squarely on Jimmy's jaw. The force made him spin and fall flat on the bare wood floor. Too smart for your own good, that's what I always said. Uncle was up and pacing, ignoring Jimmy's writhing body sprawled out below him. Just like your daddy can name every star in the sky, but can't hear the devil knocking on your own front door. When Jimmy at last had strength enough to speak, he passed over the obvious and went directly to, "Who told you?" "Martha Claxton's girl, Rose," Uncle said. He was sitting again, but his spirit vibrated with perpetual motion. "She cleaned rooms up at White Pine, said she saw Miss Cecilia crying to her brother. Your name was mentioned." And that, Jimmy supposed, was that. The frogs in the creek out back had gone quiet. The night was still with tense expectation. Then Uncle stood. "You need to leave," he said, "now. You're a damn fool for not running at the start." The old man moved with swift confidence, easily maneuvering through his home with nothing but memory to guide him. He took the canvas satchel that held a lifetime's worth of woodworking tools and dumped them onto the kitchen table before throwing it with perfect accuracy in Jimmy's head. "Put your things in, hurry." Jimmy reached out, and everything his hand landed on, he stuffed into the bag. It was deep, designed to carry a workshop on one's back, and the trappings of his life vanished into it effortlessly. His 2 sets of clothes, his shoes, his father's battered copy of Great Expectations, a thin quilt, it was over in seconds. Outside, the early morning was warm. A fox barked, and it sounded like the cry of a frightened, lonely child. "Head upriver," Uncle said as he walked, dragging Jimmy behind him. "You'll land in a place on the border called Red Sulphur Springs. Walk in anywhere and ask for Sam. We'll get you the rest of the way." "Rest of the way where?" Jimmy asked. "Where am I going?" "To a better place, Lord willing." Jimmy still wasn't entirely sure what was happening to him. Only minutes ago, the world turned on an expected, predictable tilt that ordered his days. Now the last of his family was urging him to run from the only home he'd ever known. A noise grew, something outside of the clamor of the forest, something offensively human. A glow began to bloom on the eastern horizon, and a mass of angry voices so solid that they formed a living beast slumped toward Uncle's home. The man did not turn his head to the noise, but his ears were peaked to it. He did not look afraid, only very tired. "Come with me, Uncle," Jimmy said. He held onto his shirt, his arms, anything he could reach. "I won't leave you here. If they can't find me, what'll they do to you?" Uncle took Jimmy's face in his hands. After all this time, they still felt so large and imposing, hands of a giant. The same hands that dragged him out of a burning house while his parents screamed somewhere inside. The hands that reared him, the hands that were pushing him away. "I'm an old blind man, son," Uncle said. "Ain't much left for them to do to me. Besides, I should have done this a long time ago. Your daddy all but begged me to. Maybe he'll forgive me now. Listen, you just leave here, Jimmy, and you don't look back. Not once, no matter what you hear, no matter what they say. Don't make your father's mistake. There ain't no honor in suffering, not even for the ones you love." Uncle shoved Jimmy hard, and he stumbled down to the stream that ran behind their home. The older man looked to be standing far above him. The light of the myriad fires shone bright at his back, the massive voices roared, and someone called Jimmy's name with the vehemence of a madman. It sounded like Young Jr., in a calmer, older, more exhausted voice spoke, possibly old man Levi himself, come to witness his grandson's falling. Uncle walked away, right into the mouth of the beast, and Jimmy did not see him again. The heavy sand of half-dried creek beds clung to Jimmy Blue Eye's pants as he ran. Cypress branches snagged at his clothes and tore at his flesh. He fell 10, maybe 20 times, fumbling in the cold black dark, but he didn't stop. He didn't look back. Not even when he heard the rifle shot ringing through the night. One long, lone crystalline note, a wail with no beginning and no foreseeable end.
Hi, here, good to see you again.
Yes, you do.
Okay, so you kind of went over the inspiration for the book, but without giving any spoilers away for people who have not read, give us a brief overview of the story of the Mayor of Maxwell Street.
Sure, of course. Well, it centers around 2 characters. One we just met in the prologue. The other one, her name is Nellie Sawyer. She's the daughter of the wealthiest black man in America, a fictional character who deals in horse breeding. And when their family comes to Chicago to not celebrate, but to acknowledge her brother's funeral, she's thrust into the world of black high society when she goes from being the second child to the heir to her father's immense fortune. But she has different ideas in mind. She is also a journalist, or striving to be a journalist. She writes under a pseudonym, and she's given this opportunity to discover this head of an underground crime syndicate that is only known as the Merrick Maxwell Street in Chicago, Illinois. And she takes on this opportunity and ended up crossing paths with who we now know as Jay Shorey, who operates an underground speakeasy, but also was very much involved in a lot of the underground and criminal scene in Chicago. And together they really dive into this world of Chicago criminality, corruption, the classism, and own divisions in black upper class society, while discovering their own desires, their own needs, and their own hopes for who they want to be in the future. So hopefully that gives enough of an introduction without too much of a spoiler.
Okay, so when you are right, because this has some historical fiction to it, what is your process of the story, the narrative, and being true to the history? How do you do a percentage? How do you kind of navigate
Walk that line. So I love historical fiction, and for me, when I was growing up, historical fiction was how I was exposed to most of the new time periods and individuals and parts of history that I maybe wouldn't be exposed to in an academic environment. I was exposed to through historical fiction, and I don't think that historical fiction should always be in education. I do think that historical fiction authors should operate with a level of responsibility and acknowledgement to portray that world, that time, those people as accurately as possible. But also there is a very thin line between portraying an accurate story and telling a good story. And what someone, an author, once told me was, once you start to fall into a black hole of research and trying to become an expert of a certain time period or a certain place, that's when you should start to step back and really remind yourself what the story is. Because so often you can end up really trying to become this utter expert in whatever this minute specific time period is. And we're authors, we're fiction writers. Most of us are not historians. So we have to try to hold on to the essence of the story. So when I started to feel myself going into that black hole, when I went on this very, very long tangent into architecture of this one specific building in this one specific neighborhood, and I said, I think I'm getting a little bit lost in the weeds here. And you have to honor the story, you have to honor the characters. And what I always try to do with the historical setting is treat it like a stage set. Like say, for example, if you were to go see a Greek tragedy or a Shakespearean retelling where the time period was shifted a bit. The clothes, the sets, the mannerisms might reflect that time period, but the characters are still operating as themselves, as their own archetypes. And so that's how I try to kind of view this history as set dressing, things that characters can interact with, can engage with, that informs the story, but doesn't always drive the story, because that's when you start to get a little bit lost, I feel.
How did you come about finding Maxwell Street in that history? Can you tell people about that?
Yeah, of course. So Maxwell Street, for those who aren't remember, is an actual area in Chicago, West Side Chicago, I believe. It's moved around a couple of times due to construction, though I think it's moving back to the West Side. And it's been around for 100 years. It is an open market. It's known for its market, the Maxwell Street Market, that has always been this kind of gathering place of commerce. So many ethnic communities built up around Maxwell Street and Maxwell Street Market, from Jewish communities to Black communities, South American communities, Eastern European communities. It really became this center where if you have something to sell and you have something to barter for it or money to spend, then you can find a place there. In a really starkly segregated city like Chicago, it was kind of this bright spot of equality, where everyone could find a place on Maxwell Street to exist, to sell, to interact with each other, all in the name of commerce, really. And when I really started researching Chicago at the time, I found out just how much Maxwell Street played a role in the 1920s aesthetic. The Prohibition era had a lot of roles and experiences on Maxwell Street. There's this theory that there was kind of an underground highway built under Maxwell Street to help transport illegal goods. the people who have lived on Maxwell Street say, of course, there was no underground highway here, that we had nothing to do with Prohibition, but we'll see. Chicago has a long history of saying things that aren't entirely true about it. But also musically, the Chicago blues really came up out of Maxwell Street, especially with all of the Black Americans who are coming up from the South during the Great Migration. A lot of them settled around Maxwell Street, so Southern blues became Chicago blues, which became the blues of the 1920s. So it's a really wonderful area and has exceptional history. And thematically, why I wanted to deal with Maxwell Street is because I love that idea that here at this place, you could find a way for yourself, a name for yourself, an identity for yourself. And for our characters, identity is really central to all of their motivations. Who am I? Where do I belong? What is my purpose? And how do I achieve that in a world that is striving very hard to put me in a box and to force me into a status quo? So while Maxwell Street does have some plot significance in the story, it also has a great deal of thematic significance for all of our characters.
What surprised you, if anything, in your research process? Or did you find something that took you a different route than you originally planned?
I think what's wonderful about research are those moments where you have a plot idea and you dive into research and you find out that your plot idea is actually completely valid and can be completely backed up historically, which is wonderful for me. I love those moments. Then of course there are moments where this plot idea is like, well, this technically couldn't have happened, so I suppose I have to change things. But in terms of things that surprised me, and this answer might come as a surprise, I was surprised that so much of the conversation around Jim Crow and segregation and what in my household was called James Crow, it's kind of the better dressed cousin of Jim Crow, how northern cities especially really developed and maintained these ideas of segregation and oppression, but in very subtle ways, in ways that maybe weren't explicitly violent, but were still explicit. And of course, these are things I hear about growing up in my family and in my homes in the South. You kind of joke about it and say, of course, everywhere you go, that's going to be the way, but the research really did confirm all of that in the clearest terms. There's one document I found which was called The Negro in Chicago. It was a report issued by the government of Chicago around 1920 after the 1919 race riots. And it's a massive document, thousands of pages. And it was the government of the city really trying to understand how did the 1919 race riot happen. This was a time where you had so many Black Americans coming into the city, really changing the demographics of the entire area, and the government was curious. They said, we do not understand what the living conditions or the life for a Black American in Chicago was like. We want to understand that a little bit better. And it's a wonderfully detailed and unbiased, surprisingly unbiased document. And there's so much evidence of the way, let's call it James Crow, was built into every aspect of Black life in Chicago, from talking to bankers who wouldn't sell or provide mortgages to Black families, not because Black families couldn't pay. In fact, many bankers said Black families pay consistently and very well, but we don't want to offend our clientele by publicly endorsing or promoting Black clients, so we don't sell mortgages to them, or jobs that are provided for them or available to them, or where they can live, where they can work, where their children can seek an education. So seeing that displayed so clearly was a really interesting surprise, but also made the character interactions and experiences in the text so much more real and valid, and you can have a true source that backs up all of these experiences and feelings that people were having at the time.
So we've talked about Nellie, we've talked about Jimmy, or Jake, but there's a third character also. Do you want to talk about him?
Jim Tomas? Okay. He's a bit of a fan favorite. He wasn't always my favorite until I listened to the audiobook, and I was like, oh, okay. But Tomas Escalante Hiroshi, he's based off of a family that actually existed in Mexican history, and they still have some ties to European history. I won't try to mispronounce their actual last name because there are a lot of R's in there and I cannot roll them. But this was a family that was very much built on capitalism in Mexico, land ownership, governance, And by including a representation of his family, I was trying to show all the different colors and shades of elitism at this time. I wanted to show that there could be other brown individuals outside of Black Americans who are living this really wealthy and extravagant life, and the way that elitism and classism can still leak into other aspects of society, no matter who you are, no matter what your culture is, no matter what your ethnicity is, to really display kind of the larger issues at stake for so many Americans and non-Americans, especially of color. And Tomas himself, he's the heir to, of course, a fabulous fortune. We love him. But he's also Mexican and also has indigenous ancestry, and we get to see him interact with Nellie, one of our main character, and really discover and uncover a lot of his own history and how he's had to deal personally with how his family has treated indigenous people, how they've treated Mexican people, and how he himself, being Mexican, has to come to terms with that. So he was a really fascinating character to write, and like I said, he wasn't always my favorite, but as I listened to the audiobook and Bonnie Turpin's incredible interpretation of him. I believed in his romance with Nellie a little bit more, but before I didn't believe in it that much.
Okay, what I love about Nellie is that she could live the good life. She wouldn't have to work. She wouldn't have to do anything. She could do what her family expects of her and be fine, but she wants more. Then on the other side, another awesome character, Sequoia, who is almost there. She wants to be at Nellie's level, but she knows how to play the game. We talked a little bit about this in March. So go into a little bit more about Sequoia and her kind of foil to Nellie.
Yeah, of course. So Sequoia MacArthur, she's a friend of Nellie's, a pseudo-friend. It's really difficult to get to the heart of Sequoia's motivations, but she is the daughter of a prominent bishop within the Black church, the Black community. She's very much the flapper aesthetic, very in the know, loves fashion, loves parties, loves the scene, loves being aware and familiar with everyone. But Sequoia is also someone who's very intimately aware of what role she's expected to play within that society. She may come from influence, but she does not come from money. So she has tried to make herself someone that people will remember, someone that people will involve in their parties, their institutions, because of how flamboyant she is, because of how exciting she is, because she always knows the best gossip about the best people. But that's an aspect of survival for her. And she's actually a great foil to Jay as well as Nellie. Jay and Sequoia are both characters who are trying to make themselves into whomever other people need them to be in order to get to the next stage. And that offers a really great view for Nellie, who, as you said, is a character who's coming from unprecedented wealth. She never has to work a day in her life. She never has to strive for more than what's presented before her. She never has to walk anything but the steps that are laid out for her. But Sequoia is set on going her own way, because she knows if she doesn't, then that option's not going to be available for her. If she does not make a future for herself, she'll have no future. And I think Nellie, coming up against a character like that, it opens her eyes to a lot of things. It opens her eyes to her own privilege, but also allows her to see people as more than what they present themselves to be, to have a little bit more empathy and to have a little bit more insight, which is something that like all youthful people, she thinks she has in spades, but it's not until she's really faced with the diversity of life that she understands her own biases and her own limitations and how she can accept people as they are.
So we have the storyline trying to find who this mayor of Maxwell Street is. And there's also the storyline of the horse breeding and horse racing. How did that come about in your narrative?
Yeah, so Nellie's family, they're Kentucky horse breeders, and I wanted to honor the history of Black influence on Kentucky horse breeding and Kentucky horse racing. Prior to Jim Crow, some of the best horse trainers, some of the best jockeys were Black Americans, and I wanted to acknowledge what a future might look like for a Black family that was allowed to have their full potential within that realm, within that industry. Of course, there were roadblocks in place that didn't allow for Black Americans to reach the heights of horse freedom in Kentucky, as they would probably naturally without those oppressive stimulations. But with Nellie's family, I wanted to acknowledge this is what a family who could be allowed to go the distance in this industry could really look like, and really acknowledge that history.
Okay. Is Nellie completely made up, or was she inspired by someone?
She is completely made up, which is fascinating, which is what I love. Now the story is full of cameos. It's littered with real people from history. But for our main characters, Jay and Nellie, those are characters. They are their archetypes. They're their own creations. They exist in this world independently. And I think that allowed me to have a little bit more room for those characters. As I said, I had plenty of cameos. I wanted this world to feel as real as possible. I wanted our characters to interact with individuals who would be walking around, interacting and moving in this time and this space. But for Nellie and Jay, I wanted them to be their own world. And it's a sad fact that Nellie is not based off of anyone. There could really technically not be anyone like her existing in this time in actual American history, but that's the fantasy and the beauty of writing and fiction especially, where you can build this ideal or this world and see how it would clash with the reality, so to speak.
So we're reading the whole book. We're trying to find out who this mayor of Maxwell Street is. Is the character who's the mayor, was it always this person, or did you go in thinking, well, maybe it might be this person, maybe I might have it be this person?
I'm trying to be.
I know.
It was always this person, and okay. I guess what I would say is the story of discovering the mayor of Maxwell Street. The novel is not a capital M mystery. It's not really, in my view, for the reader to discover who the mayor of Maxwell Street is. This is Nellie's journey. This is her discovery. So I've always been perfectly fine if readers figure it out early. In fact, I love that because it builds a sense of dread throughout the entire reading of the novel, where you may know, but you're just waiting for that moment when Nellie finds out and her whole world is essentially torn to pieces. So I do love that. It's her journey of discovery. So it's really about how she goes about finding out who this individual is. Not so much for the reader, even though I love all the theories. People have come to me with whiteboards, theories and the clues, which I adore. I think it's a great honor to be read that deeply and that intricately. But as I said, it's her discovery. So we're essentially going along with her as she pieces these clues together, and it's a lot of fun for me when readers figure it out a little bit before she does.
I want to take it back a little bit to your kind of origin story also, because I don't want to keep asking questions that may give something away. But tell me what fostered your love of storytelling? Did you grow up writing? Was it a certain book that, sparked something in you as a child?
So it was truly my mother. My mother, she is a lover of reading, a lover of books. She had a teacher who built that love inside of her from a young age. And she always encouraged me to experience stories and to read broadly and to have this wonderfully interactive view of storytelling. And because of that, her early influence, I think I've always been this person. She likes to tell the story of how when I was maybe 3 years old, I would sometimes stand on the stool in our kitchen and just orate. I would just tell these marvelous, nonsensical epics to invisible crowds of people, and I would just go on ad nauseum for hours and hours telling these stories. And one day, she stopped and she looked at me and she listened and she was like, well, this is surprisingly intricate for a child. And she wrote one of them down, one of these stories I told. She wrote them down and she showed it to me. She said, this is what you were saying. She read it back to me. And that, I think, was the first spark in my head of these ideas I have, these stories that come to me and through me, they can exist outside of me. And that might not have been, the moment where I said I want to become a writer, but I think it was the first moment where I saw the value of storytelling and the value of my stories, I think. And then from there, it was just constant exposure. Another moment I talk about is when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, and my mom was watching a Hamlet marathon on Turner Classic Movies, and they were showing all of the cinematic interpretations of Hamlet going back to the 1930s all the way up into the 1990s. And I was able to swing out with my mom, so I said, okay, I'll sit and watch these with you. And we watched all of them, all 5 or 6 interpretations. And she did her best to explain everything to me. And of course, I didn't understand everything as well as I would later in life, but it was a beautiful moment for me because it was the first time I'd been exposed to a story where the hero was fundamentally flawed and was still the hero and was still, you could still have empathy for them, you could still cheer for them and root for them even though they made these terrible mistakes. And I was fascinated, and that changed my entire view of narrative, I think, of storytelling, and just to continue to push me down this path to where I am now as being an author, and really set a foundation for the type of stories that I want to tell and the type of characters I want to explore.
Do you outline, or do you write out and just as the words flow?
Well, I in terms of if I'm a pantser or a plotter, or as George R. R. Martin would say, an architect or a gardener, I think is his terminology. Before my debut, I feel like I was probably a gardener. I very much like this romanticized ideal that was planted in my head during undergrad, where you're taught that the great authors of American letters, they just sit down at some point during the day, usually maybe at 1 p.m., by their lake in New England, and they lead into the typewriter, as Hemingway said, and then it's the best work that's ever existed, and you get up and you go on with your day, and that's it. And this debut experience really taught me how to be a professional writer, and taught me that the work that goes into writing a novel. The Merrimack Street was sold on proposal, so essentially I had a deadline before I had a book. And that made me an architect. That made me someone who believes fundamentally in the value of an outline. That in order to stick to a schedule, to produce something in its entirety, you have to know where you're going. You have to be able to lay out all the tracks and do that work early, so you don't get bogged down, halfway through the story realizing this plot doesn't work at all. I have to start completely over. When you're on a tight deadline, you can't afford to start over. So that was a big mind shift for me. Where as I said, I had this romantic ideal of you sit down and your talent manifests itself, and there you go, you have a novel where, in truth, to be a professional author who is able to write consistently and write well, you have to build that type of routine into yourself, into how you think about storytelling, even when it hurts, even when you have writer's block and you hate everything that you write. I have professors that always told me you can't edit what you don't write. So even when it's awful, if it doesn't exist on the page, it doesn't exist at all. So I had to develop that skill. But I really believe in it now. I think having an outline made this process much more enjoyable for me. And I don't think I'd go back to the other way now. Unless, of course, I became, a great author of American letters and not had a house finally.
Are you part of a writing group? Like when you started out, did you have I know, because I love to read the acknowledgments often, that they'll be thinking they're writers groups. Were you in one when you started out?
I was when I was in college. I went to DePaul University in Chicago for my undergrad and graduate degrees, and I was a part of a writing group and a writing community there. And that was really fantastic for me. I'd never been a part of a community of writers like that before, and even though I wasn't writing or working on the Merrimack Street when I was in that group, that being a part of that community taught me that writing is a community experience. It does take a village to tell a story. There's this idea that an author exist within themselves, that they are their own world, that everything that goes into a story or to a book is entirely of that author, when that's not entirely the case. It really does take having people to talk to, having people to work through, having people who inspire you to be able to tell a really thorough story. And being part of that writers group taught me how valuable it is to have that community. Once I graduated and started the whole 9-to-5 adulting thing, I didn't have as much time to build that community, but I still am in touch with my writers group. Most of them read early drafts of the Merrick Maxwell Street even from a distance, and so I have a lot of respect for writing communities and the work they do in making us all better writers and better readers.
When you were working your 9 to 5, were you working on Maxwell Street then, or did you say, you know, enough, like I'm doing this, this is my passion, I'm stopping this, and I'm putting everything into my book?
Oh no, I definitely worked 9 to 5 while writing. I'm still working 9 to 5 while writing the next book. And I think that's also part of the work. The authors who are able to focus entirely on their writing careers, God bless them, they're like 1% of the population. It's either because they publish 2 books a year and they write a book in 2 months and they're able to have that incredible turnaround, or the type of authors who have such a great following that they can live off of each book existing, you know, with 10 years between each book, like some authors can. And those are the authors that hold up the industry. We love those authors, but that's not the reality for every author, which most of the writers probably on that table are writers who have some manner of 9 to 5 job. So I respect that, and I acknowledge that, and I love that you can still create this work and be a part of this community while still, you know, existing in the world. It doesn't have to be a choice. It's a balance, of course, but it's possible to do both. And every writer I've ever talked to says, do not quit your 9 to 5. You quit your 9 to 5 when you retire. That's the smartest way to exist as a writer. Again, it's talking about turning the romanticized ideal into a profession, into a livelihood.
Well, I imagine all of your outside work also, you get inspiration.
Exactly. It's the world that it broadens your world so you can feed off of it a little bit more. You're not trapped in, you know, I guess my hovel and all this, just trying to build off of what you already know, what you already experienced. When you're able to get out into the world more, interact with more people, that's more fodder for more characters, more interactions. It makes everything a little bit more vivid, I think.
Something that strikes me is that, you know, you've written this gorgeous book, and it is yours, and it is, you know, very private, you're intimate with your book, and then it's out in the world, and then you kind of have to flip because you're doing social media, you're doing all the marketing. Talk about that, about going from the private, just let's me and my book, me and my words, and then world here, you know, here's my book, please read.
Right, and it's a very stark and immediate switch, and it's not a switch that I think anyone prepares you for. Again, there's this myth that you write the book and you turn it over to this wonderfully experienced team of people who are going to market it and push it and make it a bestseller, and you barely have to peek your head out the door. But that, again, is not always the case. A lot of being a published author means self-promotion, means being able to view your book as a work of your heart, but also as a product. And in truth, I expected that switch to be really jarring and uncomfortable, but it was a wonderful kind of breath of fresh air. It allowed me to view this story from outside of myself, if that makes sense. I was able to not take it so personally, I assume. When you're in the book, you know, especially someone like me who strives to be a perfectionist and tell the most perfect story in the most perfect way, I was able to step back and see the value in my own work and see the bright spots in it and be able to promote it as such. So I appreciated that ability to view it from a marketing perspective, because it made me fall in love with my own work all over again, instead of the kind of weight that you feel when it is a work of your heart and you're so intimately connected with it and you're so afraid that, you know, you'll be misunderstood. When you're able to step back from that, it offers a wonderful new perspective. It's hard, it's terribly hard work, but there's some fun in it as well.
Speaking of the marketing, let's just talk briefly about that gorgeous cover. So talk about that. It's beautiful, and the real person who is featured on the cover.
Yes, so another thing that I didn't realize about publishing is that your publisher has no contractual obligation to tell you about the cover, ask you anything about your opinions. So in October, I think, of 2022, they sent me this document and this beautiful image, and they said, here's the cover. And I was like, oh, we're there already? Okay, that's great. Can I offer any feedback? No, it's done. All right, okay, great. That took me a moment, I think, to step away from, because, as an author, you obsess as much over what your future cover might be as much as what your future book might be. And I had all of these visions in my head of what a historical fiction cover should be based on how I grew up and, Ken Follett novels and things like that. And once I shared this cover with a group of other authors, we call ourselves the debut class of 2024, all the authors that are publishing their first books this year. And their response was so wonderful, and that allowed me, again, new perspective. And I was able to really take a look and see just how beautiful but also intelligent this cover is. The use of the lush, vibrant tones really does underscore the luxury and the wealth that's inherent in this novel. You get the sense of 1920 Chicago without it being explicitly 1920 Chicago. And more importantly, they put our main character, Nellie, front and center, directly into the main focus of the novel. And why that was so important to me is we were just coming out of this era of book design where novels, was especially about Black women, were a little bit afraid to put a Black woman on the cover. They would be like a mixture of different shapes and colors, and if you step away and you kind of squint in your head, oh, that could be a Black woman, but up close, it's like, this is abstract and not in your face, and there was this real fear of showing representation on the cover because there is this ideal that it would detract readers, and I was so impressed and proud of my publisher for saying, no, this is our main character, this is what she looks like. They spoke to me at length after it was done to make sure that her skin tone matched the skin tone that you described in the book, and really to make it clear to the reader, this is our main character, this is who you're going to be reading about, this is the story that we're going on. Which was deeply inspirational for me and motivational, and gave me all this faith in my publisher. And in fact, this is the model for this cover reached out to me when she saw one of my videos on TikTok, and she's like, hi, I'm your main character on your cover. And that was incredible. That's something you don't even really think about. All of the many people that go into every single detail of this story. You may think that this is just something that they pick out of a bank of photos, but there's so much intentionality behind that. And being able to connect with her was really wonderful. It was kind of an author milestone I didn't expect. It was really a beautiful moment. So now I have so much respect for the iconography of this cover and how it brings readers in and gave this book more of a platform, I think, that I would have experienced otherwise.
Okay, well, I've kept you for too long. So now I'm going to open it up to audience questions for Avery.
Yeah, so you're talking about the book writing process as well as the marketing process is really interesting. Do you find going about it now for a second book that you would do either something different in the writing process or the marketing for your second book as well?
I think it's interesting. I think with your first book, with your debut, you have this feeling that you have to go as hard as possible. You know that this is your last chance, fancy. If you don't do all of this work up front now, then you're going to sabotage your entire career. And that's really not the case. There is this idea that your debut novel is going to set this kind of foundation for who you are as an author, but it's not going to determine your career as an author. So I think I would maybe not take myself so seriously. I think I would back off a little bit. I think there's like this period of time when the marketing was going on when I committed to calling every Barnes & Noble in the United States because I was not satisfied with the initial order from Barnes & Noble. And my publishers were like, well, that's just, that's the way the cookie crumbles, babe. And so me and my determination, I was like, well, that's just unacceptable. So I called about, I think I had about 5 states left when I ran out of energy. All those Barnes & Nobles, pitching myself, pitching the book, and it was a beautiful experience. I was able to connect with all these booksellers and communities, but also entirely unnecessary. Did not move the dial at all. But again, I think I would have a little bit more good faith in myself, in my work, and in the community as a whole, to not think that everything that I do is going to be the thing that changes this book or changes my life. And with the writing process, I think I would operate the same way, not expecting that if I don't produce the greatest thing that I ever have or ever will write, that I'm abject failure and I shouldn't be published. I think backing up with that idea as well. Just to give yourself some grace. I think that's what, second books are for, and that's what future books are for, is allowing yourself to lean on your experience, your education, your talent, and to have some faith in your own work and your work's ability to stand on its own.
I have a question. Is this book considered a one and only, or are you going to have a sequel, or are you going to take something just a totally different direction?
So as of right now, this book is a standalone. I suppose it would be up to my publishers if they want to continue and ask for another book. I have ideas, of course. I think a story or a book never really dies, even when it's over. Those characters, they keep living on in your mind. But this book itself is a standalone, and my next book will be a standalone. And at some point, I may circle back around to this world or these characters, but we'll see. We'll see at this point.
Thank you.
Yes.
I may have misunderstood you. Did you say you had like a book deal before you even started writing this?
Yes.
And how did that come about?
A wonderful agent. Agents are important. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. But my agent, he became aware, my publisher is Hyperion Avenue, which is an imprint of Disney books worldwide. And he became aware that Disney was starting up their adult imprint again. And they were looking for books, they were looking for writers. And he approached me and was like, well, do you have anything? I was like, well, I can have something. And they were very open to, accepting things off proposal. So I wrote up a proposal about, I think, the first 2 chapters, and an outline, and I'm grateful that they read it and they viewed it and they saw some potential in it, and they were able to make an offer on just that. So it was wonderful in the sense that, yay, I have a contract, but also terrible because I don't have a book. And as you can see, she's a very big girl. I like big books and I write them accordingly. So it was terrifying that I now had this looming deadline with the biggest media conglomerate in the world standing over it. But it was a wonderfully, I suppose, liberating experience where it took out so much of that stress that comes from querying and from selling yourself, from 10 plus years of trying to get one book into the hands of one editor, and really just fast forward that entire process. So I'm incredibly grateful for it. It was a terrifying ordeal, but I could not have asked for anything more fortuitous.
May I ask what your time frame was? What they gave you to write this book?
About 8 months.
Oh.
Entirely my fault. My lawyer asked, he was like, do you want to ask for more time? And of course, that's me being afraid to ask for anything. I said, no, I can do it. Then you get 2 months out and you're like, I can't do it. But you have to. It's the nature of the beast. So again, entirely my own fault for not asking for more time. But again, I'm grateful for the experience and allowing my book to debut this year with this class of people who are all wonderful authors. I'm glad to be a part of this debut class and to start my writer life in this way. It's been a great journey.
So you said it took about 8 months. Okay, so the book you're working on now, is it going to take about that time of you get a feeling right now that?
Well, the deadline's in June, so read into that what you will. I think that's in 8 months. I don't know. The contract was just finalized last week, so yes. No, thank you. So we'll see. That's how I have to feel in my heart right now. But probably about the same time. I think for most authors, when you're writing on that kind of schedule, that's the kind of schedule that you operate on for drafting, especially if you want to write a book a year. Some people are able to do 2 books a year, which is marvelous and beautiful and fantastic, but you kind of have to wrap your head around that kind of schedule to stay in that type of routine of a book a year.
I was going to ask, do you think it'll ever be made into a movie?
I'm not sure. I think I write, as I've been told at least, I write with a kind of a cinematic lens. So I think that this type of story is really primed for interpretation in film or TV. But again, that's up to my publishers. They own all of the universal rights as Disney likes to do. So we'll see. It's really up to them. I think there's a good how to say reasoning behind an interpretation, but if not, then I'm happy that it exists as it exists.
This is just sheer nosiness, and if you don't want to share it, that's fine, but I'm just curious, what is your 9-to-5 job?
I work in the Southern College of Optometry. It's the optometry school out of Memphis, Tennessee, just in admissions, various standards.
Thank you.
Yes.
And who do you read?
And in terms of, let's see, I of course I want to shout out a couple of my debut friends. The Blueprint by Ray Rashad, it just came out. Well, I shouldn't say just came out, it's been a few months now. Her debut novel is exceptional. It's a kind of a handmaid's tale, but with this view of how Black women were treated during slavery and the whole wage system, but in a post-apocalyptic view. It's called The Blueprint, it's excellent. Let's see. Who else have I been reading? This my next book takes place in the 1890s. I've been reading surprisingly a lot of Westerns. That's usually the best kind of framework for that period in history. And I just am reading, oh my goodness, Whiskey When We're Dry, I think. And that came out in 2018. It's a wonderful Western. It's very reminiscent of True Grit, which was a favorite of mine. Let's see, I was reading Neil Gaiman before he went and shamed himself. And I'm falling back into reading. I think I took so much time writing and marketing. I'm really trying to find books and stories again to really fall into. And of course, tons of research. Lovely kind of research.
Will you sign my book?
Yes, I think we'll be in the back doing science.
Yes, we are about to get you to the back to answer more questions and sign away and meet everyone in person. Avery Cunningham, the mayor of Maxwell Street, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.